Hello and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
Welcome to Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Last Sunday saw an overwhelming response to the AstraZeneca COVID-19 vaccine registration opt-in system when all 268,000 vaccination slots were taken up in about 3 hours. The process was a unique opportunity to test public responsiveness to a parallel vaccine rollout. So what was discovered? That's what we're going to be speaking about tonight with two public health experts and find out a little bit about how they're interpreting the effectiveness of this move and its policy rationale. Joining us first on the show, we have Independent Health Policy Specialist Dr. Khor Swee. Swee, always a pleasure speaking with you. Welcome back to the show. What lessons do you think we can? What lessons, Swee, do you think we can take away from last Sunday's registration process? Particularly, that was one that was, state-based, vaccine-specific, and an opt-in system.
Melissa, I guess the first lesson we need to take is from the decision that was made for this AstraZeneca opt-in system. The first lesson that we can take is that governments must roll with the punches, in the sense that the vaccination program will look great on paper, but in reality, it's often very messy, and there will be a lot of policy decisions that will need to be made, shall we say, on the fly. So I think the first big lesson is that we must roll with the punches and to be able to be flexible enough to make decisions as and when they come. The second observation or lesson that I will share is that this remains the least imperfect solution that was available to the government at this moment. And I think the government did as best as they could. And in general terms, it was a success. Why do I say it's the least imperfect solution? Because the alternatives are unbearable or even intolerable. And the alternatives would include completely rejecting the AstraZeneca vaccine, just not using it, or even making it a compulsory choice for various Malaysians. It will be part of the mainstream vaccination program, a term that was introduced by the Minister for Science, Technology and Innovation and also the de facto vaccine minister. If you make AstraZeneca's vaccine as part of the mainstream vaccination program and compel people to take it, it would be undesirable for obvious reasons. So this remains the least imperfect solution that we have. And then thirdly and finally, I guess there is a lot to be said about choice and how people want to have a sense of control, especially during a pandemic when they feel like they're out of control.
Swee, I wonder if we could just think about that AstraZeneca vaccine issue, because many countries, while they did stop or suspend the rollout, did then continue. And I believe that WHO and even the European Regulatory Authority came back to say that they felt that AstraZeneca's benefits outweighed its possible risks. And so in terms of that, I mean, AstraZeneca could have remained a part of the mainstream, couldn't it?
It could have, Sharaad, indeed. And it's difficult to say which one is the correct decision to be made. The outcomes, I guess, have, in a sense, justified the decisions that were made. The outcomes were there was this tremendous demand. And obviously, we should look for, say, some silver linings and also to look at it very objectively, because there are also some gaps within the system. And I hope we'll get to discuss these gaps in a minute. But to go back to the decision, Sharaad, you're right. It could have been made a part of, or remained a part, not made a part, but remain a part of the mainstream vaccination choices that are made available to Malaysia, to Malaysians. And when we look around the world, we can also see that there is a patchwork of regulations and a patchwork of risk appetites of different countries. Some of them are grading the AstraZeneca vaccine to be safe for people who are older rather than those who are younger. Some people have kept the AstraZeneca vaccine as a part of the overall vaccination program, and some countries have taken AstraZeneca out of their vaccination programs altogether. So I think Malaysia is somewhere in the middle in the decisions taken by the regulatory authorities around the world.
Swee, last Sunday, that entire process, there's been criticism of it being, described as what felt like the Hunger Games, or like an AirAsia cheap ticket sale, or like a Nintendo video game. All these criticisms thrown at this opt-in process. I'm wondering whether you think those criticisms were fair.
Well, to an extent, yes, Melissa, because vaccines in a way are supposed to be a public good. So the opt-in system whereby it was first come and first served, right, and only in the Klang Valley was, again, probably the least imperfect solution that Malaysia could provide at this moment in time. To elaborate a little further is to say in the ideal situation, then vaccines will not be, say, first come, first served. They will be given to those who need it first, who need the most urgently protection from the COVID virus, and for equity reasons. That's in the ideal situation. But the world that we live in is not ideal. So I guess when you put all those pieces together, it probably is true that this is the least imperfect solution that we have. But let's set that aside for a second, Melissa, and then we explore other parts of the decision for opt-in. It has created some unintended positive consequences. So usually consequences could be unintended and negative, but in this case, there are unintended positive consequences, such as the fact that we're validating the fact that there is demand for vaccines in Malaysia, number one. Number two, that there is a significant scientific literacy within Malaysia. Number three, there is a significant trust within the AstraZeneca vaccine, despite the bad press surrounding it and some missteps by the AstraZeneca company itself. But these, shall we say, silver linings or unintended positive consequences must be taken in light of the fact that this is a very small sample size, only 270,000 people. That's about 3% of the total population of the Klang Valley, Selangor and Kuala Lumpur combined. So probably not very indicative. There are some reasons, small reasons for us to celebrate, but there are equally large reasons for us to be very cautious in interpreting the success or what we think is a success of this quite overwhelming take-up.
Swee, what do public policy makers do when they are faced with the fact that you have a population that has very different impulses, desires, and thought processes when it comes to something like a vaccination program? There'll be people who say, I want something from a Sinovac vaccine because it's been tested on Chinese people and I'm Chinese. Or the opposite, saying, oh, this is an authoritarian regime. I don't trust anything they say, so I won't take it. I mean, how do you make sense of these really diverse responses? Do you then create multiple modalities for delivery, for engagement, or do you kind of narrow it down to one single approach?
Sharaad, there is no perfect answer to this question. It's a really great question. I think governments around the world are struggling with it. In a sense, let me put it in binary terms. On one hand, you have a one-size-fits-all solution for vaccines for the entire population of 32 million people. Or you have a more nuanced solution, of course, without overcomplicating it, because we don't need 15,000 solutions, but we might need, say, 2 or 3 separate solutions. Let me broadly define the population of Malaysia into 3 categories, and I'll assign some rough numbers to it. 50, 60, 70% of Malaysians are convinced with the vaccine. They will take it, anything that's offered to them, because they understand that the benefits far outweigh the risk. About 20, 30, 40% of the Malaysian population would need to be convinced. And 10% of the Malaysian population are recalcitrant anti-vaxxers. I'll call them out, and I think that the full force of the law should apply against them. So these 3 broad categories of, let me call it 60, 30, 10, of people who are convinced, people who may need, say, some convincing, and 10% of people who are, say, difficult to convince or impossible to convince. Therefore, we need at least three separate sets of solutions for them. From the AstraZeneca vaccine decision, we can see that choice is important, a sense of agency, a sense that I can now exert some control over not so much the vaccine, but my responses towards this pandemic. For the last 15 months, we've seen that human beings have felt a loss of control, a loss of agency, that they're not capable of controlling the world and the environment around them. SOPs change all the time. The enforcement is haphazard and there are double standards. There are flip-flops all over the place. Human beings want a sense of control, very understandably so. And if we can provide one to them, a sense of control through their vaccine choices, I think this would be better for the overall outcomes of the vaccination program.
Right. Swee Kheng, earlier in the conversation, you alluded to plugging policy gaps or public health policy gaps. Where do you see the public health policy gaps, apart from the ones that you've outlined for us today? Where should we be looking at kind of plugging or tweaking, or, to use that word that's been oft used, is to recalibrate the current pandemic management?
That's a really broad question, Melissa. So maybe I'll answer in the vaccine section and the non-vaccine section, because I'm conscious that tonight we're speaking about vaccine, so maybe I'll begin there. In the vaccine section, I think several things that could be done, say, more structurally and more strategically. The first of which is, let us have a more coherent long-term strategy for vaccine confidence, supply, and delivery. That's confidence, supply, and delivery being the three most important components of a vaccination program. Till date, it feels like we're reacting to the situation as opposed to having a clear and coherent long-term strategy, which we will then implement. So I think that's one thing that we can do better. Number two is to have, say, more thoughtful ways to respond to events. Indeed, to even have frameworks to respond to, say, events that will be easily predicted. For example, the AstraZeneca safety signal will not be the last safety signal that we see. There could be the Pfizer, Sinovac, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson invention vaccine. They will have stops and starts around the world where there's a safety signal in country X, news travels very fast, Malaysia's government is, or any other government is forced to respond due to public pressure and the media news cycle, and then we may be reacting to a situation. This is unfortunate, and I don't think we should react to situations. Indeed, we should have a bit of a long-term plan with capabilities to tweak it as the situation arises, but still show us a long-term plan. And thirdly and finally is data analytics as a result of the entire vaccine rollout. How many have been vaccinated? How many have registered? How many have cancelled? Where have they cancelled? Why have they cancelled? And so on. All that information needs to be given over to the public. That's on the vaccine side. But on the public health side, the vaccination program is one part of the entire public health response. As the public health response focuses a lot more on the vaccination program, we're forgetting other parts of the public health response, like finding patients, testing, treating, isolating the patients, and publishing the information for rapid antigen tests and PCR tests. And that is after 15 or 16 months of fighting COVID, still not being done on a regular or predictable or even a comprehensive basis, without evidence given over to the public and also to analysts and to academics and the media to hold the Ministry of Health and the government accountable to performance metrics. Without transparency, we will not be able to progress in the fight against the pandemic. And finally, in the pandemic analysis, no more flip-flops of SOPs. If you're going to announce an MCO, you should announce and be ready with the MCOs and the SOPs, and no double standards in enforcements. I guess these are very simple, basic common sense stuff that we should be getting right after 16 months.
Exactly
we should,
right.
I think, is the operative word. One last question. How do we have that conversation about our risk appetite, Swee Kheng, when bodies like the WHO say the benefits outweigh the risks? It means that perhaps somebody will get one of those rare, side effects and perhaps die from it. Should we react because one person dies or a couple of people die? I mean, I know it sounds very harsh, but how do we manage those facts?
Sharaad, perhaps in two ways. The first one is to provide training to the media, because the media, online newspapers, broadcast agencies, and so on, right? They're a crucial intermediary between the regulatory agencies and the public. So the regulatory agencies of the world, like NPRA, like the US FDA and the EMA, the US Food and Drug Administration and the European Medicines Agency, will probably have to engage a lot more with the media. The NPRA, for example, in Malaysia, could run media workshops on reporting adverse events in a very ethical, responsible, and very level-headed manner. There is a difference between coincidence and causality. A lot of the side effects would actually be coincidental rather than caused by the vaccine. But because by law, regulatory agencies and doctors are obliged to investigate every case and every adverse event, even though it may not be related. For example, you have a vaccine and then unfortunately get involved in a traffic accident, that will still be reported, even though it may be coincidental rather than causal. So that's one thing that we can do to interact more with the media. I think secondly, what the regulatory agencies should also do is also to get media training. So not only should regulatory agencies train the media, I think the media should also help train regulatory agencies. Let me introduce an organization to all of you. It's called ICMRA, or the International Coalition for Medicines Regulatory Agencies. So the NPRAs of the world, the FDA, HSAs in Singapore and NPRA in Malaysia, they're all part of the ICMRA. And I know that the ICMRA provides training to the media and also receives some training from the media as well. And I think through this good relationship regulatory agencies training the media and media training the regulatory agencies on how to communicate better, I think that's a great way to sort of manage the way we communicate adverse events and their necessary follow-ups.
All right. Swee, Kheng, thank you so much for speaking with us tonight. Appreciate your time. We're going to take a quick break here on Consider This, but more in just a couple of minutes, so stay tuned.
Dan maju. Induknya adalah Melayu.
Balik kepada Islam. This is orang yang membuat polisi.
Kalau itu yang dikehendaki, fine. Mungkin kita berbeza pandangan.
Tapi kita mempunyai kuasa yang boleh menentukan budaya di masa hadapan.
Polisi yang mesra wanita, sudah tentu dia akan datang daripada pemimpin wanita.
Perang COVID-19 masih belum berakhir. Dalam kita berusaha memutuskan rantaian wabak ini, kita jangan terpedaya dengan virus maklumat palsu. Simak fakta melalui www.astroawani.com atau aplikasi Astro Awani. Teruskan berdisiplin, ratakan lengkungan pandemik ini.
The third wave of COVID-19 has taken us by storm. There's no room to take anything lightly. Everyone must follow all the steps to stop the spread of COVID-19. Social distancing, face mask, follow these steps, this SOP with the utmost discipline. Together, we can flatten the curve.
Bila sentuh soal berita, tiada masa untuk tunggu. Kepada anda kami bawakan fakta, susulan dan kupasan yang terkini. Tiada drama dan tiada pengulangan. Usah tunggu lama-lama. Awani 745 lebih awal dari biasa.
Kini berwajah baru.
Ini pula susulan khas pesawat Back Air di Kazakhstan. Pesawat berkenaan dilaporkan tergelincir 2 kali.
Notifikasi berita terkini dan navigasi mudah. Podcast dikemas kini dengan berita dan program.
Rebirth, reformasi resistance. Hi, thanks so much for staying with Sharaad and I on Consider This. Let's continue our look at the lessons learnt from last Sunday's AstraZeneca vaccine opt-in registration for Selangor and KL residents. 260,000 people registered for a first dose, but they represent only a small percentage of the millions of adults who live in the capital and surrounding states. So what do we know of the success of that opt-in process? Joining us on the line now to share his opinions is Dr. Helmy Haja Mydin, Consultant Respiratory Physician at Pantai Hospital KL. Dr. Helmy, good evening. Thank you for joining us on the show tonight. So what are your thoughts on the government's decision to number one, carve out the AstraZeneca vaccine from the mainstream delivery of the national vaccination program. And number two, the choice of opt-in system. And finally, number three, opening that registration only for residents of KL and Selangor. What do you make of all these different things coming together on Sunday's registration process?
I suppose it was unexpected, but it was a pleasant surprise to many in many ways. So if we take a step back, the reason it was done in such a way was because there were all these increasing concerns, perhaps unjustly, with regards to the risk involved. And it was to basically make sure that those who sign up to MySejahtera felt more safe, felt a little bit more confidence, and at the same time to perhaps test and see what would happen if we were to allow people to make a choice. And in this particular case, we had the AZ vaccines. So I think overall, it was very pleasantly surprising to see how people were rushing to get it. Having said that, there are also lots of people who still had lots of reservations, who were asking around. And I caught part of your conversation with Dr. Khor earlier, and he mentioned how about 20% of people, or rather 30% of people, were the fence sitters. And these are the people that you'd want to target when it comes to pushing them forward and giving them the right messaging. So I think that was very good. As you kind of, you're alluding to, it's KL and Selangor, so perhaps not across the country. But bearing in mind, it's kind of a proof of concept rather than a fixed way of doing things. And I would imagine that if things were to work out well, then the next time the AstraZeneca vaccine were to come on board, they may perhaps continue this with all the, addressing all the lessons that we need to kind of bear in mind as well, including things like the servers being overloaded and making sure that this is accessible not only to people in KL and Selangor, but across the country, as well as those who have connectivity.
Yeah, Helmy, I mean, it did produce with some people a lot of anxiety. I think there, and partly because of those technical problems, some perhaps, criticisms that the system itself should have been tested first before it went live on Sunday. But I want to come back to this, to the anger it seems to have provoked in some people, that it became too much of a game. This first come, first serve principle that was that undergrid the system was essentially unfair. Do you think that we should take such a harsh view of what the government did on Sunday?
I wouldn't necessarily say it's unfair. Once again, this is carving out a small number of the overall total of vaccines to try a new way of doing things. And yes, it was not perfect. Yes, there were issues with the server. But, I've had friends who were quite proudly telling me how they opened 10 different tabs at once, each time clicking on a different time, a different location. And if you imagine thousands of people doing that, you are going to overwhelm the server no matter how well prepared you are. And having said that, even beforehand, there were lots of concerns about the fact that people would not be signing up. So I wouldn't say I know the details as to what degree they were preparing for this. Yes, it could have been better. Yes, there were lots of hours of anxiety with regards to people trying to click in for both themselves and their loved ones. But at the end of the day, most people did get the time and the place that they wanted, and most people were able to sign up for the vaccine. Is it unfair? It's a small number, and once again, it is not actually excluding others from getting the vaccine. We have a situation where we are offering vaccines where people are not turning up to get their vaccines. And I'd rather see people opt in and get the vaccines that they want and protect more people than for people to be forced to take something that they don't want and not turn up in the end.
Those people that you mentioned who have signed up and don't turn up, some figures have put it at 15-20% of those registered under phase 2 that didn't show up, and then therefore led to wasted precious vaccine doses. Do we know if that is attributed to vaccine hesitancy or some other flaw within the system that we're not addressing?
I don't know the details, so perhaps this is one of those things where a bit of information coming out from those in charge would be useful, because then we can look into how we can improve matters. I would imagine some of it would be hesitancy, some of it would be perhaps even simple logistics. What I would imagine would be suitable and really necessary is to find a way in which we minimize the waste. And I know for a fact there are ways of doing this, that they are looking into people who can come in at the very last minute. But having this in a more systemic fashion, in a more practical and perhaps a more transparent way would also be useful, because it means that there'll be more people who'll be able to come in. If it is issues with vaccine hesitancy, then I would imagine that there are people that we can identify. There are people that in some way we can perhaps introduce something punitive. But that's just me being a bit harsh.
Helmy, there are, of course, different communities around Malaysia with maybe different capacity. You talk about somebody with 10, tabs open. Not everybody in Malaysia is digitally savvy or digital native. Do you think when we look especially at marginalized groups that are outside the mainstream grid in terms of information, those who suffer because of the digital divide, that we'll need to find different strategies? Do you have a sense of what those strategies might be? Not using apps and so on and so forth. What could it be for them?
It would depend on whether we're talking about, say, those in the urban areas who have poor connectivity, or perhaps even those in more rural areas. Now, in an ideal world, and I do believe that they are looking into this. We are wanting to see if we can perhaps use different types of vaccines for different types of areas. So, for example, if we were to come across and get a supply of single-dose vaccines, then those would be more suitable to be given in more rural areas. If, let's say, we're going into the deeper parts of Sabah, Sarawak, even Peninsular Malaysia, you'd want to be able to go to the people rather than expect them to come to you, because getting multiple families, dozens of them coming across to urban centers to get vaccinated is not logistically possible, nor is it something that's financially viable for a lot of people. So in a small number of people, if we are able to identify those who are more vulnerable, that it will be the job of us as doctors and healthcare professionals to go to them and give them the vaccine.
Right. Can I ask you, Helmy, because you did say in the beginning of our conversation, last Sunday's registration process was essentially a test to see, how people would react if they were given a choice. And clearly, overwhelmingly, people wanted that sense of agency, that sense of control. Do you think then, Helmy, that the right move should be to have this opt-in system put in place to perhaps give people an option of specific vaccines, time and date of when they want to get their vaccine slot? Is that something that you think should be done in the future?
I think in terms of timing and date, then yes, there should be some mechanism where people will be able to proactively get their whatever time or date that they feel most appropriate. In terms of the choice of vaccine, the problem remains the fact that we have far greater demand than supply. So we're not in a position where we're able to buy 20 million doses of each type of vaccine and offer a smorgasbord of choices to people all around us. If that were the case, then yes, everyone should be able to just pick what they want and when they want. But we may be able to choose when we want it, but as to what and what type of vaccine, which country it comes from, I think logistically is just impossible. And once again, the idea right now is to vaccinate as many people as quickly as possible so that we get people protected, so that we reduce the chances of variants being produced within our own community.
Helmy, you're anticipating some of the questions that we might face in the coming months, because we know that the vaccine candidates around the world have turned into real opportunities. Vaccines that now have been tried and tested, thinking of the Russian Sputnik V, Bigamel, and all those others that are now already being used in other contexts. Do you think we're moving fast enough in terms of approving these different vaccines, or is our caution, in fact, something good?
I suppose it depends who you talk to. I think we are going at just about the right pace, in the sense that we have professionals in the NPRA, we have professionals in the JAV. I always forget which letters are in there. But essentially, you want them to be able to look at the data properly. You don't want them to rush into making a decision that they may regret. Because it's not just about vaccines coming in, it's about making sure that, say, for example, they are repackaged in Malaysia. You want to make sure the process is safe. And if you just look at what we've been experiencing for the past few weeks to the past few months, there are so many people saying all sorts of nonsense and sharing all kinds of scare stories. The last thing you want is to cut corners in the safety mechanism and in the process in which they are supposed to follow, and then for that to be a mistake. Because at the end of the day, we are all humans, and the process is there for a reason to minimize the mistake. I'm sure somewhere along the lines we talked about the Swiss cheese model, and this is where we want to make sure that all the appropriate precautions are taken in order for us to be able to make the right decision, so that the people get the benefit with minimal side effects.
Helmy, thank you so much for joining us on the show tonight. We really do appreciate your time and your insights. But that's all the time we have for you on this episode of Consider This. Before we leave you, a reminder, don't forget to get all the latest news and information on COVID-19 vaccines at astroawani.com and the Astro AWANI app. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan, signing off for the evening.
We will be back with you same time tomorrow. Till then, good night.
Good night.